So, Wrio is finally character in Genshin Impact, and I figured that I should cover some of his kit, how to play him as well as his team building and more in this video. I personally really like his playstyle and I've been enjoying him so far, although there are two main things that I won't be covering in this video. First, I won't really be covering any of Wrio's constellations in this video, and second, I won't be discussing anything regarding pull value. I don't have much interest in Wrio's constellations at the moment. I don't typically discuss pull value, as that is something that's very subjective and dependent on a person's account. Anyways, onto the actual video. If you look at Wrio's base kit, you can immediately tell that he's an on-field damage dealer. His skill buffs his normal attacks in a similar way that Wrio's skill buffs normal attacks. His A1 passive buffs his charged attacks, and his burst deals just 5 instances of damage. Before I move on to the actual beef of the video, I want to discuss a common misconception from leaks. There was a common belief that before he released, that you need to be in between 50% HP and 60% HP all the time to make use of his A1 passive. This isn't actually true. Once you drop below 60% HP, you'll gain Wrio's Gracious Rebuke and it'll stay even if you heal past 60% HP, which allows you to use his buffed charged attack with his A1 passive. As you can see, Kokomi is healing Wrio, and there's this red glowy aura around him. That means his A1 is active. For combos, the main ones you want to be doing are 5 N3C N3, 4 N4C N3, or 3 N5C N3. Here's the damage difference for each combo. 5 N3C N3 is the highest damage overall, but it's very reliant on stamina. 4 N4C N3 heavily encourages the use of dash cancelling and charged attack, and 3 N5C N2 is pretty much the easiest combo while maintaining decent damage. It's the combo that I would personally recommend, but the difference between all three combos aren't insanely huge. Feel free to mess around and see what's best for you. At the end of the day though, the most important thing is to stay above 50% HP, so don't hesitate to abandon your combo to use his A1 passive to heal yourself. As for weapons, I'll just go over them briefly as I have Calcs weapons for freeze and mount. For freeze, his best free to play option is R5 Flowing Purity, but the Event 4.1 Event Catalyst isn't too far behind. Witsith is kind of a special case where it can be really good or bad depending on buffs that you'll get throughout your rotations. I wouldn't recommend using Witsith for freeze or monocryo, as it can be worse than Flowing Purity if your buffs screw you over. As for melt, weapon rankings is this. Keep in mind that substats can change some of these a little bit, but this is a pretty accurate ranking of his weapons. A few things that I want to say are that Witsith typically isn't very good outside of melt, but it's very good in melt teams. Even at its worst, R5 Witsith is better than all free-to-play options by quite a bit, and sometimes it can get close to his best weapon options. If you don't have Witsith, then Flowing Purity and Ballad of the Boundless Blue are decent options for him, although Witsith is pretty much the best 4-star weapon for him. As for 5-star weapons, only ones I'd recommend using are Lost Prayers, Tome of the Eternal Flow, Scar's weapon, and obviously his signature weapon, Cash Flow Supervision, which is his best in slot weapon. Artifacts. This is the set you want. It's his best set by far, with a few exceptions. Those exceptions being 4 Blizzard Strayer in Freeze, which is only a tiny bit better than 4 Marachusei Hunter, and 4 Shim in Melt, which is still behind 4 Marachusei Hunter, but it's still pretty decent. 2 beast options are just 18% attack, 80 EM, and 15 damage percent. You can use those if you don't have Marachusei Hunter for Melt, but Blizzard Strayer is still marginally better for Freeze. As for Wrio's energy requirements, he doesn't really need to use his burst, as the damage you get from it is very minimal, and it's really not a lot of damage. You can settle at around 100 ER. Now for Wrio's talents, it's pretty straightforward. His talent priority is his auto attack, then his skill, then his burst. Auto attack, skill, burst. As for team building with Wrio, you pretty much always want a healer. Wrio's damage multiplier on his skill pretty much means that you just always want to stay above 50% HP, as I've already said. We can go into our first healing slot, so Wrio pretty much wants a healer. You're going to have a healing slot in every Wrio team. First one that I should probably mention is obviously going to be Bennett. He gives an attack buff, he heals your on-field character. You can use him in Melt, you can use him in Monocryo. Now as for any teams with Wriothesley and Bennett, you pretty much just always want to go Wrio, Bennett, and if you either play Melt or Monocryo, it's usually Wrio, Bennett, Kazuha with the flex slot for Mono Cryo, or you can play something like Wrio, Bennett, and then 2 flex slots for Melts. I think that first I'll go into Melt teams, as those seem to be Rio's most popular teams at the moment. Along with Bennett, you can either use Shangling as your Pyro enabler, or you can use a Burning Aura, which is usually Nahida plus another Pyro unit. For Melt teams, you can use something like Wrio, Bennett, Shangling, Shenhe, or the classic Bennett, Kazuha, Shangling core. The main problem with Kazuha, Shangling, Bennett is that you just don't ever swirl cryo, and even though most of your damage, or at least a good chunk of your damage, is coming from Wrio, you also have Shangling doing damage, and Kazuha doing a little bit of damage, so you have a solid core, but Wrio doesn't necessarily fit in extremely well, and he's not extremely synergistic in this team, as where with Shenhe instead of Kazuha, you have more buffs on Wrio. You have Res Shred, you have Shenhe's Quills, which makes the team more synergistic with Wrio. Now this doesn't necessarily mean that the team is better than Kazuha, Bennett, Shangling core or worse. It's just something that I wanted to point out. Now your second option for Melt teams is Burnout, which is Bennett, Nahida, Thoma. Yaoyao also works in the style of Nahida, but it can be a little jank. Yaoyao just does less damage and just doesn't buff as much as Nahida does, which makes the Nahida team better by a considerable amount. Now, you can also play Bennett in Mono Cryo, something like Wrio, Bennett, Kazuha with another cryo unit. Ideally, Shenhe, Rosaria, and Ganyu can also work as well. This can make for a solid Mono Cryo team. And speaking of Mono Cryo, you can actually replace Bennett with Mika. The main benefit of having Mika instead of Bennett is that you aren't restrained to a circle for your damage and healing, which can be a huge benefit against bosses and enemies that move a lot. Another thing about Mono Cryo is that you pretty much always just want Kazuha all of the time, as all of your damage is coming from cryo damage, and Kazuha buffs that by quite a bit. As for your last slot in Mono Cryo, you have mostly 3 choices: Shenhe, Ganyu, and Rosaria. Ganyu and Rosaria are more of off-field damage healers that do off-field damage, obviously. Shenhe is more of a buffer and debuffer. Now, moving on from our Mono Cryo team archetype, I want to discuss Freeze, which is pretty much just Wrio, Anmo, Cryo, and 1 Hydro. Now as for your healer slot, you can use Mika or Diana. The problem with Diana is that she doesn't really provide much aside from a shield and healing, where Mika provides healing and attack speed, which surprisingly boosts Rio's damage by a little bit. Your Animo character is pretty much always going to be Kazuha, but if you don't have Kazuha, you can use Sucrose or Hazel. They both work as a replacement for Kazuha. As for your Hydro slot, you can use Yelan or Xingqiu. Both of them work quite well, although Yelan is a little bit better than Xingqiu. This is because Yelan has a passive that gives damage percent, as Xingqiu doesn't, but he does give some extra healing as well as interruption resistance. Now you can also do this, where you replace Mika with Kokomi. This allows you to use a more offensive cryo character, such as Shenhe or Ganyu or Rosaria. That's pretty much it for Rio's team building, although before I end this section, I want to recommend a few teams for each archetype. For Melt teams, I would recommend Bennett, Shangling, Shenhe, or you can replace Shenhe with Kazuha, or even Sucrose, Thoma, Nahida, and Bennett is also an option, and it's fairly strong. For Mono Cryo, you're pretty much just glued to Wrio, Kazuha, and a healer. Your 2 healing options, realistically speaking, are either Bennett or Mika, and then you have your flex slot, which can be another cryo character, such as Shenhe, Ganyu, etc. As for Freeze teams, you can either play Kokomi, Shenhe, Kazuha, or something more like Mika, Kazuha, and Yelan. As for Freeze, you can pretty much just replace your 3rd cryo character or Bennett in Mono Cryo, and then just replace that with a Hydro character. Your 3 Hydro choices are Yelan, Kokomi, and Xingqiu. Xingqiu mostly works as a stand-in for Yelan. Another thing that I forgot to mention is that you can play Jean with double Hydro, and that about wraps up the team section, but there is 2 new characters that I do want to talk about that could potentially synergize very well with Wrio. Charlotte is a cryo healer that could possibly hold TTDS depending on her energy requirements, and Farina is apparently going to be a hydro off-field damage healer that drains your HP, so that might have something to do with HP management, which is something that Wrio already has to do with. Either way, I'm looking forward to both Charlotte and Farina's release, and I hope you are too. The last thing that I want to discuss is Wrio's strengths and weaknesses. His main weaknesses are that he needs a healer to function, he has a hard time to front load damage, bosses that move a lot can make his DPS drop significantly, especially if you're playing with Bennett. His field lock makes it hard to keep debuffs and he to skill up in multi-wave content. Although he does have very easy to build teams with a lot of team options, and his sustained damage works well against some content. And that's all for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope that you guys have a good day or night wherever you live.